Hello, I'm Emma-Louise Coffey, and you're welcome to the Dairy Edge, the Teagasc Dairy podcast. We're bringing you the latest information, insights and opinion to improve dairy farm performance. As pregnancy diagnosis is confirmed on farm, we turn our attention to whether to cull empty cows early or milk them on until December. Dairy specialist George Ramsbottom joins us to consider the best option for our farms, depending on cow suitability and feed availability on farm.
So I suppose if we think about it in spring calving herds, and it's mostly spring calving herds we're going to focus on in this interview, there's about 100 days milk left in those herds from around the 1st of September. So if you work out September, October, November, and 10 days in December, maximum of 100 days is what's left in those herds. And there's probably slightly less than that if you're being honest, because maybe a third or a quarter of the cows will be dried off by early November to allow for condition and younger animals getting a bit longer of a dry period to allow them to recover their condition for the next calving. So around 80 to 100 days is what's left. In money terms, if we work off a figure of around 15 litres per day, there's and 60 cents per litre for the milk, there's somewhere between 700 and 900 euros worth of milk left in many of the cows that are in spring calving herds at the moment. So there's a good bit of money left out there to be drawn down over the next number of months.
And if we look at it then from the context of feed supply, and we would have spoken with Joe Patton previously back in July, and at that stage things were very healthy when we were looking at winter fodder. I suppose things have persisted from a drought perspective, and the picture may have changed on a lot of farms. Some insight from you, George, in terms of what you've seen across the country from a feed and forage point of view.
Well, I suppose just to recap there, Emma-Louise, the survey that was done earlier in the year showed that on average on dairy farms, we were in a very good position with forage. Now, I've never seen such variation between regions in the country. So, for example, there are farms in the north and northwest that are feeding 17 and 18 kilos of grass dry matter per cow per day and 1 or 2 kilos of meal at the moment. And in other regions of the country, there's anything from fully silage and meal diets going in to maybe 6 silage, 6 kilos of grass dry matter and 6 kilos of meal going in. So there's a huge variation. And the southeast and the east seems to be worse affected by a prolonged dry spell that we're having at the moment, with very low growth rates being seen in those farms. So on some dairy farms, we'll be coming from a standing start in terms of farm cover and trying to build up cover for the autumn and for the winter, with hopefully the bit of rain that's coming over the weekend starting to have an impact in terms of renewed growth rate and maybe getting things back on track. We're a long way off in some parts and well on target in others. So there's huge variation out there at the moment. A second forage survey will be conducted in the coming weeks, and we'll await with interest the outcome of that survey.
And I guess with all of that in mind, like you've referred to the revenue coming into the business in the form of milk yield, and also I suppose the backdrop of that, what is fueling that milk yield in terms of feed. Something that we debate every year is when is the best time to cull empty cows from the spring calving system? Do we do it early and build reserves, or do we milk on and get revenue out of those cows and offload them from the farm in the month of December? I know that you've done some scenarios across a number of years, but if you take this year's pricing, what are the considerations that farmers need to think about, and what is the best strategy?
Instinctively, one always thinks that culling cows is just as profitable as trying to milk them on in through the autumn. I suppose when I'm looking at the data that I have available to me on immediate culling or milking on, this year we're with the higher milk price that's prevailing at the moment, we're seeing that if people can source forage or have forage available to them, it'll be more profitable to milk those cows on. So I've looked at 3 different options, and I use the same kind of a model every year, Emma-Louise, when I'm doing this data. I'm looking at option 1, which is cull immediately from the parlour into the factory. I'm looking at the second option, where we dry off the cow and fatten her for 60 days. And I'm looking at a third option where we're milking once a day for 60 days, feeding them heavily during that period. and sell them straight out of the parlour then after a 60-day, once a day milking scenario, selling them straight out of the parlour to the factory. And if we look at the cull immediately scenario, we're seeing, with the kind of the prevailing carcass values, the carcass value of a 220 kilo cow, a 220 kilo carcass weight, would be worth around €950 at the moment. We're assuming a relatively low kill out of around 40%, and maybe a second or third or fourth lactation cow on average being culled from the place. We'll assume she's empty and she'll kill out around 220 kilos. Now, compared to that, there's a small additional margin of around €120 where the cow is dried off on the 1st of September and fattened for 60 days. What happens is we've a higher carcass value. It's worth around €1,300 instead of $950. But on top of that, we also have higher costs incurred because we're feeding our cow on a diet of meal and silage for an additional 60 days. Someone said to me that a 40-cent drop in the value per kilo would eliminate any additional profits that were generated by drying her off and milking her for those 60 days. The third scenario we looked at then was where we milk them once a day for 60 days and then slaughter them straight out of the parlour. And what you see here is an intermediate carcass value. So instead of €946 or $950, which is killed straight away, our carcass value we'd expect would go to around €1,120. So it'd be worth about €270 more in terms of carcass value. But we'd have higher forage costs and we'd be feeding more forage. About a ton of forage and feed would be required over the 60 days. And that'll cost around €350 at current prices. But we'd additionally have around €540 worth of milk receipts there as well. So the bottom line would be that compared with selling them straight to the factory, there'd be an additional margin there of around €370 to keep those cows on. I suppose we need to look at the bigger picture on farms. And for some people, it won't be worth milking one or two cows on like that before they're slaughtered for an additional 60 days and putting them on once a day. It'll be the cleaner job would just be to sell them straight out of the parlour through the mart and let someone else take a bit of a margin on them. And the second thing that's worth bearing in mind is that it's not suitable for all cows. It's not suitable for cows that are lame or have a high cell count or are very thin at the start of September. So it's only suitable for a very select number of cows in your herd. And for some people, this just isn't worth it.
Few clarifications there, George. In option 2, you talk about drying off a cow and fattening her indoors. So you're on a concentrate, a silage diet. What sort of a silage quality do you need in order to achieve the kill out you're talking about?
So again, it's top class first cut silage you're talking about here. So you're eating into stocks of quality silage, which is why I suppose before anyone considers any of these options, they really need to go back to the drawing board and have a look and establish what kind of silage stocks that they have at the moment. So for example, I was out with a farmer a couple of days ago whom I know pretty well, and we established that all of the silage that he has in his pit is needed for the dry cows and for the in-calf heifers over the coming winter. It's good quality feed, but it'll be needed by them, and he's very, very short of additional forage. And in his case, he's going to buy in a bit of a kind of a forage stretcher to try and get him over the pinch that he sees between now and the end of October. So everyone needs to start by establishing where they currently are with their forage stocks before they look at any of these options, Emma-Louise. And I suppose for any of the fattening options we're looking at, we're talking about using a high quality forage in the first place.
And then in terms of pricing, just remind us of carcass value that you're referring to. Like you mentioned, I suppose the margins achieved, particularly with that dry off and fatten option, you are dependent on a good carcass value persisting, market wise.
Correct. So what we'll do, Emma-Louise, is we'll put all of the scenarios and information around them up on the Teagasc Dairy Daily website today or this week, and all the scenarios will be in there and you can see how we've costed them. But we use carcass values in the order of 430 kilo for the straight to the factory option, That's a P grade, maybe a 3. We use a value of €4.60 per kilo for the dry off and fatten scenario. And we use an intermediate value of €4.45 for the once a day and milk on for 60 day and fatten at the same time scenario. So 4.30, 4.60, and 4.45 are the carcass values that I use for the 3 different scenarios.
You also mentioned, George, it's a certain type of cow that is suitable for this system, a healthy cow. So, probably a cow that isn't lame, a cow that doesn't have high cell count. If we think about the average herd in the country sitting at around 90 cows, I suppose, how many cows would you estimate would fit into the category, in terms of selecting an appropriate option for them?
With a herd of 90 cows, and we'll work on the assumption of maybe targeting 10% of the herd that are empty or have a high cell count. Well, if we've 10%, that's 9 of those cows would be the ones we'd consider for these scenarios. And then maybe of those, maybe 2 or 3 will be lame or of high cell count. So that would leave us with around 5 or 6. So you're talking about typically 5 to 7% of the herd would be the kind of numbers that would be suitable for maybe a once a day scenario and for 60 days before they're slaughtered. So not all the cows, it's not a big number of cows. It's not really going to make anything up in terms of additional margin unless the scale is fairly big.
For a farmer in the situation, George, where feed supplies are extremely tight, rain is on the way, but it's not necessarily going to solve the problem overnight. What sort of options do you see farmers engaging with in order to fill the feed gap at the moment?
Okay, so some of the options that are available to fill the feed gap, if we look back historically, first of all, Emma-Louise, at kind of growth rates that resumed when the droughts or dry spells broke, there were no records set, even in the autumn of 2018, after a prolonged summer drought. Growth rates across September, October, and November were only average with the previous number of years, looking at the pasture-based data. So I can't see any records being broken this autumn, if and when the dry spell breaks. And we're into September now. So typically we'd be looking at growth rates for the month of September of the pasture-based analysis of around 50 kilos. So I don't see any more than that growing per day for the month of September, even if the drought breaks just now. In fact, I'd say on average it's going to be slightly less than average, because on the drier farms where we have it very dry, it's not so bad in the west and north as such, but on the drier part of the country, we probably see somewhere between 30 and 40 kilos for the month, rather than 50 kilos. The options available, first thing, step 1, assess how much silage you have versus how much silage you're going to need for the winter itself. And then you'll fill the gap afterwards. So the options or scenarios that are there afterwards are straw is one option. It's coming in, relatively speaking, it's coming in at value compared to silage bales. People are looking for up to €50 a bale at the moment. Straw is probably better value than that, but you need to have a way of feeding straw. So you need to be able to have full access for the cows that are on straw, and then feed a supplement on top of it to keep the dry cows going, because the dry cows you'll be feeding it to. But in terms of value or cost and quality, they're both excellent this year. That's number 1. So the second option that people have would be to look at some of the forage, the feed stretches that we can use, such as palm kernel or soya hulls, as an option in addition to the concentrate feed that they're purchasing for the cows. And I suppose the third option that's there then is to look at the purchase of additional silages in from other farms to make up the gaps. But at the moment, we're in a very strong position in terms of forage, or we seem to be, and we are also in a very strong position in terms of feed availability. So there's a lot of positives out there at the moment. There's no need for panic or anyone to rush into buying forages. Start with establishing what's on the farm and then make up the gap if there is a gap accordingly.
To summarise, George, let's look at the scenario for somebody who is in that prolonged drought. And I mean, defining the prolonged drought, speaking with some farmers, they are heavily supplementing since July in the southeast, and I suppose more so in the Munster area now, there's a lot of people supplementing heavy over the last month. So for these scenarios where they are maybe zero grazing or feeding back the second cut silage and maybe eating into the first cut, is the option one in terms of your culling strategies the only solution for them, or do they consider option 2 and 3 as well?
For someone in the scenario where they're starting to feed their silage stocks to the cows, their first cut silages to the cows, the quickest and simplest option for them would probably be to go down the route of a quick cull of a small number of empty cows, unless they can get forage at reasonable cost available to them. The forage saving with a 1st of September cull of a cow is around 3.4 tonnes of forage dry matter between the 1st of September and the 10th of April next year. So the earlier the cull takes place, the greater the forage saving is going to be.
That's great, George. It is good to get an insight into some of the context in terms of income we can expect from now to the end of the year from our milking cows, and also the options in terms of feed strategies where things are tight. Thank you, George.
You're very welcome, Emma-Louise.
That's it for this week's episode of the Dairy Edge podcast, and my thanks to George Ramsbottom for joining me on this week's show. In order to understand aspects of the Dairy Edge which are most appealing and beneficial to you, our listener, I would appreciate if you could take a few minutes to complete the survey included in the show notes to give your feedback. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to the podcast. You can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify, and for more information go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm Emma-Louise Coffey, and join me next time for your Dairy Edge.